comrades, and welcome back to another episode of USHANKA Show – Stories about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа USHANKA Show. If you're new to my channel, my name is Sergey Sputnikov, aka John Wayne Cheeseburger, and back in 1971, I was born in the USSR. Okay, so recently I got a question from Nick Johns 9278 who asked about the video about firefighters in the USSR, and he also asked were apartment fires a regular thing. Okay, so before we talk about Soviet firefighters, let's talk about apartment fires in the Soviet Union, because it's actually a really good question. Funny thing, when I started thinking about fires in the Soviet apartments, I thought about my experience in the United States of America back in 1995. This is what I wrote in my American Diaries 1995 on September 26. Soon we could see the gray mass of tall skyscrapers in the distance, downtown Chicago. All four lanes were packed full despite the early hour. Suddenly, I noticed a very familiar sight among the alien megapolis landscape, a row of brick high-rises, the apartment buildings that you couldn't imagine any Soviet city to be without. My goodness, Glenn, I yelled and pointed at it. Back home, I live in a building just like that. Glenn smirked at me and shook his head. Really? You live in the projects? What is the projects? I had no idea what he was talking about. Andrei was no help. He just grinned and pointed back towards the approaching buildings. I looked closely and detected something really bizarre. Almost every high-rise had boarded windows and spots where the walls were charred black from fires. I had never seen anything like it. Mind you, I had lived in apartment buildings my whole life. What in the world is going on here? I asked, dumbfounded. Before we arrived at the airport, I learned a good deal about the affordable housing projects, food stamps, gangs, the Cabrini Green fiasco, and other fascinating details about the life of poor people in America. It was a real eye-opener. Actually, later I found out that we were driving by so-called Robert Taylor homes, which was a public housing project in south side of Chicago between 1962 and 2007, and it was the largest housing project in the United States that consists of 28 vertically identical high-rises. And I lived all my life is in the vertical identical high-rises. Mine were 9-story high, but we also had 16-story high buildings. And I find it very interesting that these public housing projects were quite a success in the Soviet Union. You know, it provided affordable housing for millions of people. Meanwhile, in the United States, same kind of idea, affordable public housing failed dramatically. And I believe those high buildings were demolished, not only in Chicago, like Cabrini Green is gone, there's Robert Taylor home's gone. I think St. Louis took down their apartments. So it failed dramatically, while in the Soviet Union, it was doing just fine and still doing fine. And I think the main reason why it failed in the United States, but it was so successful in the Soviet Union, because for the Soviet citizen to live in an apartment, that was like a better way than have your own house. Because if you had your own house, that meant you have outhouse, you have probably no running water. It was just like really primitive, pretty much log cabin or brick little building without any modern conveniences, while apartment building offered hot running water, cold water, bathrooms. So that was kind of the way to go. And since it was affordable, we had everyone, well, almost everyone was poor, but that was premium housing for us. While in America, these public housing projects were pretty much exclusively for poor people. And I'm looking at that Wikipedia article, and it says that in Robert Taylor homes, a survey was conducted and showed that the majority of residents either had a family member in prison or expected one to return from prison within 2 years. Meanwhile, in my apartment building, we had a family next to us. They weren't doing really good because the guy was hardcore alcoholic. So they were a little poor. They were borrowing money from us to make it till the next, call it paycheck. I don't know, we didn't have paychecks. Meanwhile, like apartment above us, it was a successful family. The guy was an engineer. She was a teacher in some college. So they were like well-to-do people. Later, they even they could afford to buy a car. So Soviet apartments was a mixture of pretty much all groups of people, blue collar, white collar, and everything between. And my family lived in the Soviet high-rise apartments all our lives pretty much. I lived till 1998, and I don't recall a single fire in our building or any fires in nearby buildings. Sure, fires occurred, but nothing nearby what I remember. And of course, since the mass media, newspapers, radio, TV would never make reports about fires, so if there was a fire on the other side of town, we will never find out about it because would be never in the evening news or anything like that. So, information was kind of, I think it's the word, compartmentized. So maybe neighbors knew about the fire, but no one else did. What I remember the main problem is smoking. So people who would smoke cigarettes on the balconies, they will toss cigarette butts outside. They will, extinguish or not extinguish. They're just gonna chuck them outside. And if there'll be a windy day, it could fall on the balcony below. And if people store some stuff, maybe old newspapers or whatever else, it could catch the fire. So I remember that was the issue. That's one of the reasons why my dad, pretty much right away after we got our apartment back in 1981, we had 2 balconies. He actually built like windows, so he made those balconies kind of like enclosed. So this way it prevented from cigarette butts to fall in and start the fire. But still, when I started thinking about it, I'm surprised that there was so little amount of fires, because otherwise I would know about them. Because, most men smoked, most men consumed a lot of alcohol, and that's quite often what would happen. A person will smoke while drunk on the couch watching TV, falls asleep, and that's how it starts the fire. But I believe married couples, women actually were pretty hardcore. Like my mom put her foot down right away, and my dad was not allowed to smoke in apartment, even on the balcony. He had to go outside and have a smoke. So this way, our apartment never smelled like cigarettes, and it's of course reduced the risk of fire. So I think one of the reasons why we had so little fires is Soviet women that kept their men in line. And if you take into consideration the fact that most Soviet apartment buildings had natural gas, it's even more amazing that we had such a low amount of fires. So we cooked on natural gas. So every apartment had in the kitchen a gas stove, except 16-story apartments. Those had electric stove. So yeah, I don't recall much kitchen fires as well. So this is pretty impressive to think about it. Unfortunately, I don't have any numbers to prove it, but I believe the issue with house fires existed in much grander scale out in the country, in the villages, because people used wood-burning stoves to keep their homes warm. A lot of them used it daily also to cook in their brick stoves. So then you have way more issues, because if you don't clean your chimney regularly, the whole stove can catch fire. Then if, something will roll out the stove and fall on the floor, it can catch fire. And of course, moonshining. I believe a lot of fires happened because people were doing moonshining operations, or as we call it, cooking borscht in the barn. And that's what was the reason of many fires out in the country. A while back I made a video about my experience of making moonshine with my grandpa, and I'll provide the link below in the comment section. But we did it in his small barn where he stored hay. So you can imagine if somebody is making moonshine and maybe start drinking fresh moonshine, pass out cold, it's easy to set the whole place on fire. And we had one street in our village called Rosha. And that place was notorious for moonshiners and like hardcore alcoholics. So that place had fires quite often. Like it was well known that that whole street burned out completely several times over the years, because once one house will catch the fire and the wind is blowing the right way, then the whole street will burn down to ashes, because every building is a log cabin. Okay, boys and girls, I think I'm done padding this video, and now it's time to get to the point and talk about Soviet firefighters, советские пожарники. If fire burns, in a neighbor's house. Who you gonna call? Пожарник! Also a while back I made a video about telephone service in the Soviet Union, and once again if you missed it, a link will be in the comment section. And there I mentioned there were several numbers that you could call free of charge. And every Soviet payphone had a little placard attached which says «Бесплатно вызываются», so free calls, «Пожарная охрана» 01, so firefighting service 01, militia or police 02, скорая помощь ambulance 03, и служба газа, so natural gas service 04. So to call firefighters, all you need to do is just pick up the phone and dial 01. Otherwise, the cost of the local phone call was 2 kopecks, 2 копейки. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you guys like that I include short lessons of Russian language. If you like it or not, please put in the comment section, because then I can just drop it. I don't have to do it, but I thought it was kind of beneficial for my videos and for your information. But I have to talk about Russian language in this case. And I don't know how many of you guys speak more than one language, but for those who do, especially if you speak second language fluently, at some point you will realize there's words that are missing in different languages. For example, in Russian language, we usually say ruka, and it means both hand and arm. Another example, in Russian language, there is no verb for to kick. So when you kick the ball, you say you strike the ball or you hit the ball. So it doesn't have actually a word to kick like with your leg. So it's kind of interesting, right? So guess what? When I was preparing for this video, I realized that English language is missing a word too. Like you guys have a word fire, and it means like campfire, and it means house fire. Well, in Russian language, they have a word пожар. And пожар, that's just like fire that you don't want somewhere. So it occurred in a house or an apartment. So if something is burning that you don't want it to burn, you call it пожар. And then, of course, if you have a fire like campfire, you call it костер. So the Russian word for firefighter is, well, it's complicated. Back in the Soviet days, when I was a kid, I always knew the word was пожарник. Пожарник. But sometimes in the late 90s, early 2000s, it's changed, and now they say пожарный. So it used to be пожарник, it became пожарный. And to make the matters worse, some people told me that now пожарник means actually the person who creates, like does the arson, creates the fire. So he's a пожарник. So we have this weird change of words from пожарник being a firefighter to пожарник being an arsonist. But when I was telling people, no, we used to say пожарник, and they'll get all angry with me, I'll send them a picture of this badge, which is called excellent firefighter, отличный пожарник. I was like, don't tell me that back in the Soviet days they would give a badge for excellent arsonist. So пожарник used to be firefighter. And back in the 70s, we also had this badge called юный пожарник. So that's a young firefighter. So someone who went to some kind of training for kids and excelled, or maybe he called the firefighters when he noticed the fire, he'll get this cute little badge, юный пожарник. And also notice that in the modern Russian language, they introduced a new word, which is kind of like a carbon copy of an English firefighter. It's огнеборец. It's more like fire wrestler. So now even пожарный is not being used a lot. They prefer to be called огнеборцы, fire wrestlers. Another interesting fact I must mention, Soviet Union, Soviet cities never had fire hydrants. Like in the cities, we don't have that stuff at all. And it was really bizarre to discover fire hydrants in American movies because, it's a really popular thing to show in a Hollywood blockbuster when somebody plows in the fire hydrants and then this water shoots up in the sky. Soviet cities don't have that firefighting system, providing water for the firefighters. And so they had to bring, when they come to fight fires, they had to bring tankers with them all the time because there is nowhere to get additional water. Similar situation out in the villages. I remember people are saying, yeah, they were fighting the fires, then they had to stop and drive to nearby a lake to suck more water into the tank, come back and continue fighting fires. So there was different firefighting strategies. You have to minimize water usage and be smart. Okay, and now it's time to talk about Soviet firefighters and firefighting services in the Soviet Union. I was surprised when I discovered that Soviet firefighters belonged to the same ministry as the Soviet police. Of course, we call it militia back then, but firefighters and police were one department called MVD, Министерство внутренних дел, Ministry of Internal Affairs. And before that, it was called NKVD, People's Commissariat of Inner Affairs. It wasn't easy to become a Soviet firefighter. First of all, you had to serve in a Soviet army. So you spent 2 years, being drafted in the army. After that, you could apply and become a student of the firefighting college. It took 3 years in the firefighters college to get graduated, and a person will get a rank of junior lieutenant. So this is how you start your firefighting career, becoming a junior lieutenant. And while you serve in the firefighting department, you can move up, of course, in the ranks, but your ceiling will be a major. You cannot move any further up without additional education, and the major will get your job in the fire department as the fire department chief. And if you want to continue climbing up in the ranks, then you need to go back to school. So now you go to ВУЗ, высшее учебное заведение. So it's like an institute of firefighting, and then you can move up to a general pretty much. And of course your pay would improve as you move up in your ranks, and I couldn't find exactly how much people used to make during the Soviet days of the firefighters. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but there were some perks. One of the major perks, you could retire after 20 years of service. So you could retire pretty much like age of 45. So that was great. And if you're a firefighter, you'll get a phone line in your apartment right away without waiting, because, it's part of your job. You need to be available to answer your phone. What I found interesting, so that part of the firefighting service was called военизированная охрана. So that's like armed firefighters, like armed with the side weapons. Then another part of the firefighting service will call professional, and as the people who served at the factories, like you need to have a fire brigade at the factory. So there'll be guys who work at the factory and also volunteer to be firefighters. That was called professional, which makes no sense. If you volunteer, you're not really a professional. Professional if you do it as your profession. So anyways, a little confusion there. So since the Soviet firefighters were part of the police force, they could be utilized for patrolling the streets or helping cops. So there were cases when the firefighters participated against demonstrations, because guess what? They had fire hoses and they could spray protesters with water. If you follow my channel, you probably know that I live in the United States since 1999, and I was surprised to find out, I live in a small town, that the firefighting department is kind of like a big deal. It's almost like a center of town. We have those pancake breakfasts all the time happens there. Firefighters is a big part of the community. We pay taxes. We pay additional taxes if they need to buy a new truck. So they were always visible here in America. But back in the Soviet days, I don't recall those fire departments were kind of hidden away in industrial areas. So I don't remember ever, firefighters interacting with the local population or doing anything like that. But I remember seeing a fire department back when I used to live in Kyiv. So I went on Google Maps and it's still there. So what's interesting, so you have 6 bays with firefighting vehicles and apartment building attached right there. So it's kind of convenient for the firefighters. Once again, you live in a big city, people don't have their own little, private homes. So you live in the building and it's very convenient. If there's the problems or you're on duty, you're right there. You can sleep in your own bed. And then if it's a time, phone call comes in about fire, you just run into the bay, hop in the truck, and you're good to go. So I guess there was another big perk for the firefighter officers. Once you graduated as a junior lieutenant, you have the right to get an apartment right away from the government. So you don't have to wait like my parents had to wait. It was pretty much by law. If you graduate as an officer, doesn't matter, police, firefighters, and military, you have the right to get an apartment right away. And on this photo, you see a fire department in my village. I took this picture maybe 10 years ago while visiting my mom. So as you see, had a bay for 2 cars and a watchtower. Of course, now it's all abandoned. I believe someone using this building to store hay for the winter. So we also had a small fire brigade in our village. I guess it was required. And I'm not sure how many people they had it full time. And then, of course, you had volunteers running to help. but this is what kind of your basic small village setup. When I was researching for this topic, of course, I ended up digging through a lot of Russian websites, and a lot of them claim that the Soviet firefighting service was like a benchmark for the rest of the world. I neither can confirm nor deny those allegations. So when everything is centrally planned and the government spend money, it's not like based on the local community, how much money they have, how much taxes they pay. It's all money coming from Moscow. I'm not sure. In some regard, it may be good. In some regard, it may be not good, because definitely Moscow was probably a benchmark for the world, but not a small town or a small village like where I used to go. So for example, I found this slide kind of interesting. It says that in 1954, there were first examples manufactured for the firefighting trucks designed specifically for the villages. So first of all, what is the difference between firefighting truck, city firefighting truck versus village firefighting truck? Well, it needs to be all-wheel drive and lifted to go on dirt roads, because a lot of villages, especially in Russia, Ukraine had a little bit better situation with, asphalt roads. So there were pretty much dirt roads everywhere. So you need to have vehicles that could go off-roading and still fight fires. For example, this slide says that in 1952, they made a first modification of AN-2, famous Kukuruznik plane, that was modified to fight forest fires. Another example, 1953, they began manufacturing of the firefighting trucks like command and control. So this truck had a radio communication capacity and also additional lighting to provide. So it's definitely designed for the cities. In 1957, the Soviet Union began manufacturing firefighting trucks with automatic mechanical ladders. So it's designed for cities. They started building taller buildings. They needed longer ladders. So they used this ZIL 157 truck and they put that ladder on it. 1954, they manufactured first test model of firefighting trucks. They used in chemical foam firefighting model. In 1956, for the very first time, they utilized helicopter to fight forest fires. 1961, once again, AN-2 Kukuruznik plane. Now they utilized the floating model, the one so you could land on the lake, suck some water in, and then take off and fight forest fires. 1962, they began manufacturing first firefighting trucks based on a ZIL 130. That's the most popular model of the truck in the Soviet Union and the firefighting truck. This is the trucks I remember from my childhood in the Soviet Union, the ZIL models. It says they were designing earlier, but they had shortage of trucks. So once again, that's your central planned economy. So they only could finish making test models for tanker based on this truck, as well as the pumper. And only in 1962, so initially they made the very first test models. Here's interesting pictures. So the firefighters fighting water with water. I'm just joking. So there's example, as I said, we didn't have fire hydrants. So this is, you have a pumper that sucks the water out of the lake, and then it provides enough pressure to have several fire hoses working pretty decent. 1968, based on the Ural military truck, they started manufacturing so-called heavy-duty type firefighting tankers. So this one to bring more water to the place of fighting fire, since there's no fire hydrants. 1987, first flight of the firefighting plane Antonov 26P. And that's the airplane was manufactured in Kiev, and that's where my dad used to work. And look at this beast. It's called Лесопожарный агрегат АЛП-10. So this is a forest firefighting vehicle based on the tractor T150K. So it pulls a giant water tank and probably has a little pumper and a plow in the front. There's another Soviet beast. In 1978, they began manufacturing of a heavy-duty firefighting vehicle for the airports. And you might recognize this truck. I don't know its name, but it's also being utilized to carry around giant nuclear missiles. Okay, my friends, it's all I have for you today. And by the way, fun fact, Comrade Sergey is also an American firefighter. In my place of work, I am required to be a member of Fire Brigade. So I go through all the training that required to be a real firefighter in the United States. I don't get paid any additional money for it, but every year I go through live fire training, SCBA training, and all other stuff that required to be done to be a qualified firefighter. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, please don't forget to like it, share with your friends, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. To another episode of USHANKA Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. So in my recent video about Soviet firefighters, I mentioned the fact that I don't recall seeing ever fire hydrants on the streets of Kiev or any other towns or cities in the USSR. And I had several comments from the people who used to be in the firefighting in the former Soviet Union, and they explained that they had a quite funky system of installing fire hydrants when you need water to fight the fire. But of course, it's way better to see one time than trying to explain 10 times. And I found a video where they demonstrate how to install fire hydrant. And that's the fire truck that I remember in the 70s and the 80s on the streets of Kiev. It's based on a ZIL 130 truck, was built in Moscow. So that's still Soviet era fire truck. Alright, so let's see how it's done. So upon arrival on the scene, you need to locate a manhole with the proper fire water connection. And it's just like bring your own bottle, bring your own fire hydrant. So let's see how much time it takes. So you need to install fire hydrant yourself. So picture there is a fire, people screaming, but you need to work on opening the manhole, which sometimes could be a challenge. It could be covered by snow, or a car could be parked on it. So here you go. He got open, and now there is the small opening there that he needs to open the lid, and that's for the connection for the fire hydrant. What I was told, you need to stay away, clear from the top of the fire hydrant, but in case if something's broken down below in the connection, the fire hydrant could shoot straight up the air. So I guess there were firefighters killed staying above. So now fire hydrant is connected, and now he slowly opens the valve. So this goes way down low for the main water supply. Now he needs to open a side valve to vent it and let the water flow. Okay, venting is done. And only now you're pretty much ready to start connecting your fire hoses and start fighting the fire. So big safety concern, if something wrong with the valve below, this whole fire hydrant system can shoot up in the air and kill you if you don't remember staying clear. And now you remove the fire hydrant. Once again, it's also lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, so it's universal system, looks like everywhere. And that's how it works in the Soviet firefighting, installing and removing your own fire hydrant. And here's another video from modern day Russia. It shows what to do if the fire hydrant connection fails to engage and you can't shut off the water. So you basically, there is a work around it. You need to remove the fire hydrant while water is still coming out. And then you need quickly to use a different special tool to shut off the main water supply. So as you see, definitely it has a lot of issues, this system. And once again, try to find that manhole. You need to know the locations. And of course, someone need to keep maintenance on these things and periodically cycle the valve, lubricate them. And I don't know how can you lubricate those connections inside of the manholes. So this is how bring your own fire hydrant system worked in the Soviet Union and in modern-day Russia and Ukraine. I'm not a big fan of that system. I like to have fire hydrant available right away. You basically run to it, you remove the caps, you connect your hoses, and then you just have a tool on your truck that you start opening the fire hydrant and you start fighting fire. So you're saving a lot of time. And I believe usually normal fires, they double in size like every 15 minutes, so every second counts. Okay, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this little educational video, and we'll talk to you soon. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the USHANKA Show, where we can all learn something new about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа USHANKA Show. In today's video, we'll continue our conversation about Soviet first responders or emergency services. Recently, I made a video about Soviet firefighters, and by the way, I would like to thank everyone who provided feedback regards my lessons of Russian language. So we'll go ahead and continue that part. I'm glad to hear that it helps a lot of people. And if you watch that video, you should remember that if you call 01, you're gonna reach firefighter department, and like this poster says, о пожаре звоните по телефону 01. Сообщите адрес, что горит, угрожает ли огонь людям. During the fire, unplanned fire, remember пожар, use the phone and call 01, and you need to tell the address, what's is burning, and is there any danger for people. And here are a couple other similar posters. О пожаре звоните по телефону 01. So once again, same message. In case of fire, call 01. And before we continue, I would like to mention something. I believe every Soviet kid, at least one, did a prank call and called 01 to scream there's a fire. We considered it was funny. I doubt the fire department responded, but I remember doing it. So that was kind of one of the entertainments we had, is to do prank calls using a payphone, since those calls were free. And in today's video, we're going to talk about what would happen, who you're going to reach if you call 02. And this stainless steel sign tells us бесплатно вызываются пожарная охрана 01, милиция 02. Militia is 02. Militia. Militia. So militia is probably a more Soviet word than a Russian word, because it appeared in Russian language in November of 1917, shortly after October Revolution of 1917, and later it disappeared from Russian language as well as from Ukrainian language. In 2011, Russia changed name from militia to politia, to police, and in Ukraine it happened in 2015. I took this photo in summer of 2015, so pretty much shortly after Ukrainian militia became Ukrainian politia, police, and they got brand new cool looking Priuses. I'm not sure how many of you recognize this guy, but this is Dmitry Medvedev, who was president of Russia between 2008 and 2012. He was a part of famous Rokirovka, a castling move, when Putin became a vice president for 4 years and Medvedev became a president. Then 4 years later, during another re-election, Medvedev suggested, hey, how about we're going to re-elect Putin again? Everyone said, yay, let's do it. And Putin got another 2 terms. Not much was going on during Medvedev rule. Well, it was still Putin's rule. But they raised retirement age in Russia, as well as renamed militia into politia. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot. Comrade Medvedev knew how to dance. He had some good moves that would put Napoleon Dynamite to shame. And now we return to our regularly scheduled programming. So militia was another Soviet word introduced to the Russian language instead of police. We had militia, just like instead of minister, we got people's commissar. When militia was created on November 10, 1917, it was called Рабочая militia, workers' militia. And 2 years later, in 1919, it became Рабочая крестьянская militia, workers and peasants militia. Similarly, the full title of Red Army was Рабочая крестьянская красная армия, workers and peasants Red Army. And I guess until 1931, militia could be considered like actual militia because it was controlled by local Soviets, local councils. But in 1931, militia became a part of NKVD, Народный комиссариат внутренних дел, People's Commissariat of Inner Affairs. And in 1946, when Soviet government decided to drop the whole concept of people's commissars and people's commissariats. Everything was renamed back to ministries and ministers, and militia became a part of MVD, Ministry of Inner Affairs, and that's how I remember when I was a kid in the Soviet Union. Most Soviet people interacted with so-called uchastkovy, so that will be kind of similar to what in America they call sheriff. So that'll be a militsioner who is in charge of the local area, uchastak, and he will have a small office, and he will be like boots on the ground. He will know all the people who live in the area. He will know all the troublemakers, and like in this case on this photo, if the kids broke the window, he will bring them to parents and talk to them, maybe write the report. So he was the guy who knew everyone in the area, and he's uchastkovy. And I just went on Google Maps and I did the screenshot. So this used to be an office of our local uchastkovy when I lived on Molodogvardeyskaya street on Chokolovka when I was a kid, and I was like pretty much everyone latchkey kid. We went to school, came back to school when parents were still at work, both parents, and then you had your lunch, do your homework, and you play outside with other kids. And we've been hanging out in this area quite often. Sometimes we will go inside to say hello. The cop will be at his desk doing paperwork, and he was uchastkovy. It looks like now it's not being used anymore. And a part of uchastkovy job will be patrolling the streets of his area. Like you see in this photo, well, he's been helped by so-called druzhinniki. So that's the people who volunteered to help the cops to patrol the areas and keep the order under control. So in this case, you got two druzhinniki and one uchastkovy, and they noticed there's a couple young guys drinking alcohol in a public area, so now they're talking to them. Just like in this poster from 1957 shows once again uchastkovy and two helpers, two druzhinniki, they rush in to the fight next to the restaurant, and this poster says that uchastkovy should use help of local people in his work. So uchastkovy, local sheriff, had just office. There was no facilities to place arrested people. For that, they had a separate buildings or part of the building. It was called Отдел милиции. So there was a police department, and that one had real facilities, with the places to lock people up, interrogations rooms and stuff like that. And the next level of militia was so-called уголовный розыск, a criminal police. Oops, wrong photo. Okay, much better. So once again, criminal police, уголовный розыск, and could be translated as a criminal search. So those guys will be working with more serious crimes like robberies, murders, and so on. And of course, we also had traffic police, which was called ГАИ, Государственная автоинспекция, State Auto Inspection. So it's a really bizarre name. It was still called militia, but they were not miliционеры, they were inspectori, автоинспектор. And just like everywhere else, their main job was pretty much watching for speeding, car accidents, and other problems on the road. And of course, out of all the militia jobs, being a traffic cop, being a ГАИ, автоинспектор would be the most lucrative job because that's where you could get bribes. I love this photo. It's beautiful mustache, and it's also beautiful golden teeth. So this guy probably worked somewhere in Georgia, Armenia with Azerbaijan, and he was doing just fine. And of course, you need to remember that not many people in the Soviet Union owned a car. Finally, I found some statistics so I can give you real numbers. So here it says how many cars in private ownership per 1,000 people. In 1975, in the city, there were 17 cars per 1,000 people. Out in the country, 13 cars per 1,000. So can you imagine 17 cars per 1,000 people? So even if you do by family, if you divide it by 3, it means there was 17 cars for every 333 families. So hardly any cars. That's why we had quite empty roads, hardly ever traffic jams. Beautiful life. Soviet police cars, doesn't matter traffic police or criminal police, was usually dark yellow with dark blue stripe, as you see in this picture. And the most popular car in the 80s, of course, was Lada Vaz-01 Kopeyka. But they also used UAZ Bobik SUVs like on this photo, as well as older Gaz SUVs like you see at this picture. They also were called Bobik. Large Gaz Volga cars were also used for police, and even underpowered Moskvich cars, but I personally don't recall ever seeing cops driving Moskvich. It looks like in Moscow they also used RAF minivans built in Latvia, and on this photo it looks like they had some serious speed gun installed on the top of that van. I was quite surprised when I stumbled on this photo. This is Polish-made Zhuk minivan. I've seen those in Kiev, but never used by militia. And of course, due to the shortage of cars in many areas, they utilized Ural or Dnieper motorcycles with a sidecar. And this is one of my favorite photos showing Soviet traffic police in action. I don't remember exactly what was going on. I think maybe a driver had a heart attack, but I don't know, that looks like a cop not gonna make it. And Soviet traffic police even had helicopters. So as you see, most Soviet police departments used domestic cars, Ladas, Volgas or Moskvich, except Moscow. Over the years, Moscow police and mostly traffic police utilized some interesting vehicles, including older models of Mercedes-Benz, newer models of, well, relatively newer models of Mercedes-Benz, as you see at these pictures. Here you're looking at a beautiful black Tatra 613. I believe they were made in Czechoslovakia, and right behind the Tatras you could see there's a Mercedes nose sticking out, and further down road all are Volgas. Moscow traffic police also used BMWs, and by the way, do you know why Soviet cops as well as blondes like BMWs so much? Because it's so easy to spell. Even some Audis end up in the service of the Moscow traffic police, and they actually had a different color scheme here. Now they're white with dark blue. And some even had Nissan Patrol. Now I must tell you, back in 1990s, I thought Nissan Patrol was the coolest SUV on the planet. When I found this photo, I thought it was a Photoshop, but then I did a little research and it confirmed that in fact Moscow traffic police had two Porsches in their service for a little bit, but that was more like a test models. They were trying to figure out if it makes sense to have cars like that in Moscow to catch bad guys. Okay, what else did I miss? Well, there is nothing sexy about this vehicle, but militia also participated in picking up drunks on the streets, and that's what you see here. They tossing him into the windowless truck, which will be delivered to Vitrizvitel, like sober house, and that's where they're gonna spend the night and pay a lot of money for the service. Women can also serve in Soviet militia, but mostly they were working in the traffic police. Soviet militia published their own magazine called, well, Soviet Militia, Sovetskaya Militia. I also need to mention that Soviet militia had their own sports club. It was called Dinamo. Any of you who in international sports may recognize Dinamo Kiev, famous soccer team, or Dinamo Moskva. Those had a soccer team and hockey team. So there were a lot of Dinamos. Dinamo Tbilisi, I believe it was Dinamo Minsk. So that means that sports club belonged to the local police, local militia, and all the players in that team were actually militia members. They had officers' ranks, but of course they never served. They only played sports. The most famous slogan about Soviet militia was "Моя милиция меня бережет." My militia is protecting me or is guarding me. It was written by famous Soviet poet Vladimir Mayakovsky in one of his poems. But there was another slogan which sounded very similar to "Моя милиция меня бережет," my militia is protecting me, to "Моя милиция меня стережет," my militia is guarding me, like I'm under arrest. And in English it's actually even funnier because бережет could be translated as guarding, and guarding would be like protecting, or you are under guard, you're being arrested. Моя милиция меня бережет, моя милиция меня стережет. And just like in America where police officers are called cops, we also had slang words for our militiamen. The normal one, like polite one was ment, and the rude one was musar. So I'm not sure how close word militsioner to musar, but musar means like garbage. So you can say there's a ment or he is a musar. And speaking of my personal interaction with Soviet militia, I really didn't have any. I was a nerd. I never got in trouble. I wasn't doing any stupid, drinking. Well, we did some stealing as little kids, but it went under the radar. I never got in trouble with militia. So I never had problems either way with them. Well, my friends, I believe it's all I can tell you about Soviet police. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please don't forget to like it, maybe comment, maybe share, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to another episode of USHANKA Show. Здравствуйте, мальчики и девочки. В эфире программа USHANKA Show. In today's video, we will continue our conversation about Soviet emergency services. We already talked about calling fire department. You call 01. Calling militia, Soviet version of police, 02. And now it's time to dial 03 and call Soviet ambulance. Call скорая помощь. Out of all Soviet emergency services, 01 firefighters, пожарники, 02 police, militia, 03 Soviet ambulance was probably called most often by Soviet people. My family called them at least twice, what I recall, in 20 years of living in the USSR. But we'll talk about it a little bit later, and right now let's start with a short lesson of Russian language, урок русского языка. Ambulance in Russian is скорая медицинская помощь, so it's 3 words. Скорая means speedy, медицинская, so like medicine, medical, and помощь, help. So speedy medical help. Скорая медицинская помощь. Ambulance. But in everyday life, people just say скорая помощь, speedy help, and everyone understands that's speedy medical help, that's ambulance. And in case of emergency, when somebody will tell you, hey, call ambulance, and they're gonna just tell you, call скорая, позвони в скорую. And everyone knows that you call in the only speedy service people need right now, it's medical help. They need ambulance. Позвони в скорую. So if you hear anyone saying позвони в скорую медицинскую помощь, you know the guy is an American spy and he needs to be arrested. For example, there's the old poster, probably from 1930s, that says «Скорая помощь выезжает только при несчастных случаях». So speedy help will arrive only during the accidents. If you get sick, you need to go to the hospital. При заболевании обращайтесь в районные пункты помощи на дому. As I mentioned earlier, I believe my family called the ambulance at least twice. That's what I remember for sure. And first time was really kind of sad circumstances. And I mentioned this story in one of my earlier videos. So my grandparents on my mother's side, Sergey and Maria, they helped us to purchase our 3-room apartment. All they had in their savings was 3,000 rubles, and we needed 5,000 for down payment. So they helped us with the down payment. But agreement was when they get too old, you won't be able to stay in their log cabin in the village in the winter. they can come to our place and they'll have a separate room. So that was kind of agreement that we had. So in November of 1982, at that time I was 11, I think it was 1982, my grandparents moved to our place and moved. They hired a collective farm truck, which wasn't a moving truck, just, open truck. And, they put their belongings in the back and they rode with the driver. Unfortunately, my grandfather decided to take along a small bottle of moonshine. He always had a one shot of alcohol before every meal, and I don't know why he decided to have a small bottle in his pocket just to have a little sip here and there. Maybe he was stressed out, I don't know. And some vodka got spilled in his pocket, so there was a strong smell of alcohol in the cab, and the driver said, "Dude, if I get pulled over, I will be in trouble because GAI, traffic police, will smell alcohol." So he asked my grandpa to go in the back and sit in the back of the truck in the open, cargo area. And of course, that was November, it was really cold. So by the time they got to Kiev, and I'm not sure when exactly he had to go in the back, but the total distance like 250 kilometers. So he was really cold, and he already had a problem with lungs. He always had like a bronchitis going on. So it got way worse, and he got very sick shortly after arriving to Kiev. So that's when my mom called ambulance, called Skoraya, and doctors came and checked my grandpa, but unfortunately they couldn't help him much. They gave him some shots, antibiotics, but he was just way too weak, and about a month later he passed away. So of course it was quite a shock and tragedy for our family because we were trying to help our grandparents, and as a result, my grandpa passed away before his time, but of course, no one to blame but him. And his second ambulance call involved myself. So I believe it was maybe 86 or 87. Anyway, we started having Fanta drinks available. Before that, it was only Pepsi, like I'm talking about the foreign brands available in the Soviet Union. Now we had Fanta, so I purchased the bottle, and I was watching some show in the living room, and I was just drinking, and it's like 0.33 liter bottle Fanta. I finished the whole bottle, and shortly after I got violently sick. I was puking, I didn't feel good, and my mom decided to call ambulance. They came, they checked me out, they said there was really nothing wrong with me, and they thought probably was the drink. And since that day, I had never touched the Fanta again in my life, ever. And now let's talk about Soviet ambulance vehicles. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and of course I lived in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. So what I remember mostly is a RAF 2203. There's like a minivan looking vehicle, and that's what the one usually on the road in the late 70s, early 80s. I believe it was introduced in 1977 and it was manufactured for 10 years till 1987. RAF 2203. The very first Soviet-made ambulance vehicle was this beauty called AMOF-15. It was manufactured back in 1925. Wasn't really a great vehicle, and I believe that's the vehicle that's shown in the poster about Skoraya Pomosh. And only by the mid-1930s, when Americans finished building Ford car assembly factory in Nizhny Novgorod, they began manufacturing GAZAA trucks, and also, based on that truck, they started manufacturing ambulance vehicles, like you see at this picture. And that's the truck you can see in the most popular Soviet comedy of all times, Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, Caucasian Captive. That's a GAZAA ambulance truck. This ambulance truck was actually made for the military and had room for 4 stretchers, but since there was no other options available for the civil service, they utilized a lot of these trucks in every city, especially large cities like Moscow and Kiev. Like this one is actually from Kiev. After the end of World War II, they started building ambulance cars based on the Soviet limo ZIS 110A, and it's pretty interesting. It's really, it's a huge car, but still it's not a lot of room inside, but I've probably had a smoother ride than any trucks. So that's the ones you could see in the cities, and I think they look pretty cool. Later in 1950s, a new Soviet limousine, this time it was a GAZ-12 Gaz-12, was also manufactured as the ambulance car. Also in 1950s, they began manufacturing ambulance vehicles based on a GAZ-51 truck. That was one of the most mass-produced truck in the world ever. They manufactured GAZ-51 for a long time. I think there was several millions of them produced. And they made quite a few of ambulance vehicles, although personally I don't recall ever seeing anything like that on the road. I don't know about you guys, but going through these vehicles, I had the feeling that it was always a shortage of ambulance cars in the Soviet Union, and periodically Soviet government, remember, it was a centrally planned economy. Soviet government would probably get enough complaints from towns and villages, so they will just throw an order, okay, take this vehicle and make so many ambulance cars. So definitely those limos, ZIS, they know good in the villages, going off-roading. So that was probably serving Moscow, maybe Kiev, Leningrad. And only by late 1960s, there was finally a vehicle that could do ambulance service in the distant villages and towns. So it was capable to go off-road. And that's the famous UAZ Bukhanka minivan. Bukhanka is the word that describes a specific type of bread that's shaped as a brick. Bukhanka, and of course you see the resemblance because UAZ minivan look like Bukhanka as well. That's why that nickname stuck. Although ambulance version of UAZ got a different nickname, Tabletka, which means the pill. And some of you gearheads and car lovers may notice there is a similarities between Soviet Bukhanka and American Jeep FC-150. I neither can confirm nor deny any allegations, but it definitely looks like Soviet Bukhanka design was inspired, in fact, by Jeep FC-150. So American Jeep forward control was manufactured between 1956 and 1965. After that, he was discontinued. Soviet UAZ Bukhanka was manufactured in 1965 all the way to present day. So it's still being made right now in modern day Russia. I don't know how many of you have seen this awesome Back to the Future meme. Doc, which year is that? Somewhere between 1965 and 2023. We are at the UAZ factory, so I'm not really sure. In the end of 1950s, the shortage of ambulance cars in Soviet Union was so severe that government decided to import some from socialist Czechoslovakia. They brought an ambulance version of Škoda 1201, which was called Sanitka, so it sounds like Sanitarka ambulance. And you could see those cars only on the large cities like Moscow and Leningrad. Then by mid-1960s, we started getting ambulance vehicle based on a RAF, Riga Aerobus factory from Latvia. So that minivan was just the perfect size to do the job. He had enough room to have a medical crew of 3 people, 2 nurses and a doctor to do their job. And there was still enough room to put a patient in. And over the years, this was pretty much on the streets everywhere in the Soviet Union. And on this photo, you see kind of basic setup of the RAF ambulance. So you have a nice access, big side door, big swing open back door. There's a room for extra stretcher. It's almost like a bunk bed. So pretty decent. And just for the comparison, this is the ambulance version of Volga station wagon, which we're going to talk about next. And as you see, huge difference. Definitely RAF Latvia van was way better as an ambulance vehicle than Volga. Unfortunately, Riga Aerobus factory wasn't manufacturing enough of those minivans, so Soviet government ordered to also make ambulance vehicles based on the Volga station wagons. And I remember seeing those on the streets quite a bit, even in the 70s and 80s. And of course, we had random ambulance vehicles like this. I believe it's 1959 Nisa bus. And I couldn't find out where it was manufactured, maybe Poland. And they even used UAZ Bobik SUVs, which is definitely not good vehicle for the ambulance work, but it could be delivering just a doctor to see a patient. And of course, I must mention this funky looking ambulance vehicle based on the microbus ZL 118. This one was a special ambulance vehicle for the special Soviet people and even called Специализированная скорая медицинская помощь, specialized speedy medical help. As you may know, in Soviet Union we had free healthcare, and it was so great that ministers and other important Soviet apparatchiks wanted to have special medical care, so they created so-called Fourth Department of the Ministry of Health, and it had special hospitals, special ambulance vehicles that took care of special Soviet people. But when it comes to the regular Soviet people, RAF 977 became obsolete by the mid-1970s, and Riga guys designed a new RAF 2203, and that pretty much became the most popular, most mass-produced ambulance version of any vehicles in the Soviet Union. From 1977 till 1987, they manufactured tons of those, and that's what I remember. Like the main vehicle I've seen on the streets of Kiev is RAF 2203 ambulance car. You may already noticed that the main color scheme for the Soviet ambulance vehicles was white vehicle with red stripes, red doors, number 03, that's the number you call, and Skora Meditsinskaya Pomosh, speedy medical help on its side. By the mid-1980s, you could see some yellow and red ambulance vehicles, usually in Moscow and Leningrad. I believe those were modified by the Finnish company into ambulance, and that's why they had different color scheme. And now let's talk about people who worked at the Soviet ambulances. Like you see on this picture, you have a driver on the right, and on the left, it's maybe a doctor or a nurse, medbrat or medsestra. So a standard crew of the Soviet ambulance vehicle consisted of a driver, and it's all he had to do just to drive. Then a qualified ambulance doctor and one or two so-called feldshery, so that's nurses. That's the one that will help doctor, and also they will carry a patient using stretchers. When I was researching for this video, I discovered that working as ambulance doctor or ambulance nurse was really hard, unthankful job, mostly because the majority of phone calls, emergency medical phone calls, were due to the drunk people. So people would have too much alcohol and then they feel sick, or they puked, or they, hurt themselves, or their family members. So they dealt a lot with drunk people, and of course that could be really stressful, especially on a night shift. My high school friend Alex actually worked as an ambulance doctor, but it happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he hated the job. He had to work night shifts. There was pretty much, if you didn't have blood, if you didn't have connections, you're going to end up working in ambulance, because the good jobs would be working at some hospital. And his stories were pretty interesting, but as I said, quite depressing. A lot of dealing with drunks. And he told me they didn't want to waste drugs on drunk people, so they would inject just the pure water in their butt cheeks. It will create a lot of pain, but of course there will be no medical effect. So that was pretty much like punishment for this, useless emergency phone calls, because people didn't need any care. They were just too drunk, and maybe wife thought he had a heart attack or something. There's only kind of interesting story he told me that one day, I believe that was a day shift though, that crew was just taking a break between calls, and it was a hot summer day, so they were parked, and of course no air conditioning in the Soviet ambulance vehicles. So they just parked on the side of the street, doors wide open, including back door, and the doctor was just writing report. And suddenly this guy staggered towards him and started mumbling like, "Dude, I'm dying. I'm gonna die." And he's like, "Oh, another drunk." So he told him, "Go away." So this person stumbled around the vehicle and collapsed inside of the ambulance van, because the doors were wide open. And sure enough, he was having a heart attack. It was hot weather, dude was overweight. So they saved him because he was just lucky enough to find ambulance vehicle, and he fell right inside. And of course, because a lot of drunk people could be extremely violent, ambulance had to work as a team together with cops, with militia. So quite often you could see Soviet police vehicle next to the Soviet ambulance vehicle coming for the same call. So like on this photo, there's a drunk being treated for head injury, and you see the lady is smiling and holding his ears. So apparently, no matter how drunk you are, they could wake you up from your stupor by pulling your ears extremely hard. So that's what that lady is doing. So this picture was taken in modern day Ukraine maybe about 10 years ago. So this is a classic example. A guy was on military leave, got too drunk, probably got his ass kicked, puked all over, including his own hat, and now he is being on a stretcher in an ambulance car. And of course, you understand that extremely drunk people, besides being aggressive, they also piss themselves, they shit themselves, they puke all over. So it was a lot of nasty work to be done. and for not a decent pay and not really great benefits. Well, sometimes there are benefits, like you could use the ambulance vehicle if it's all-wheel drive to go mushroom hunting like this crew did. Okay, my friends, it's all I could tell you about Soviet ambulance. I hope you enjoyed this story and maybe learned something new. As always, please don't forget to like this video, maybe share with your friends if you have any, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания, goodbye. Hello everyone and welcome back to USHANKA Show, the place we can all learn something new about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа USHANKA Show. Just in case if you're new to my channel, my name is Sergey Sputnikov, although some people prefer to call me John Wayne Cheeseburger, and back in 1971 I was born in the USSR. And today's video is the final episode about Soviet emergency services. So every Soviet payphone had a small placard attached to the phone, like you see at this picture with Comrade Sergey, and it had information about emergency phone calls which you could do for free. Otherwise, local phone call will cost you 2 kopecks, and you could not call long distance out of town from the payphones in the Soviet Union. You had to go to the special postal office that provided calls between the cities. So if the fire burning on a dance floor, you dial 01 and you call пожарники, the firefighters. If men in masks breaking in your house, who you gonna call? Militia. You dial 02 and you call militia, Soviet police. And in case if you just can't unbreak your heart, or you just had too much Fanta like I did, you dial 03 and you call Soviet ambulance, скорая медицинская помощь, speedy medical help. And looking at this metal placard, we see that there's one more phone number we could dial, 04, and it's called служба газа. So that's natural gas service. And of course, every Soviet citizen could use help dialing 01 if they had fire, dialing 02 if there's a robbery going on, dialing 03 there's a health issues. 04 you only dial if you do have natural gas in your apartment or in your house. Otherwise, there is no need of this service. So official name of this service was аварийная газовая служба, emergency gas service. But also stumble on this photo with the famous UAZ Bukhanka van, has a just more simple message, аварийная газ, emergency gas. This more like modern days safety sign will answer the question that some of viewers ask, what was added to the natural gas in the Soviet Union. So it says if you smell gas, and we know natural gas has no smell, but of course they added, they call them odorants, special chemicals. Our gas smelled like rotten eggs. So it was pretty obvious smell, and it says, of course, if you smell gas, then you need to immediately close the valves, open windows, and call emergency service 04, and in modern days looks like you can dial 0104, but you need to be outside the building or the room which has gas, and it says do not use cell phones. It says it's a modern day sign. Don't unplug or plug in electrical devices, and don't smoke. Duh. In this video also tried to reply to this comment. Could you please do a video on the very different way electrical, well, we're gonna talk about gas distribution is supplied in Russia and Ukraine and Soviet Union before that. Why they have those ugly yellow gas pipes above the ground? Why they use concrete power poles? Why gas and electric meters are in living rooms and kitchen indoors? It's a longer question, but right now we're going to concentrate on gas. Well, similarly to the United States, I'm not sure about Western Europe, natural gas was always provided in the large cities and, pretty big towns. And out of the country, there was no gas available, period. People always used firewood to cook and stay warm. Even in modern-day Russia, which is one of the largest exporters of natural gas in the world, or maybe is the largest, around 29% of Russian people out in the country still use firewood or coal to heat their places in the winter. Some of you may remember this video. So my mom, who moved back to her village that she grew up in, she still uses the wood brick stove to cook and heat her house, although I got her a small electric stove too to cook, but she prefers to cook also in a big stove. It's way more delicious, and in the winter That's the only way she can stay warm, is burning wood in that pitch. Some Soviet villagers who could afford it had gas stoves and propane tanks, as you see in this picture, and they were placed right inside of the house, right next to each other, which is super duper not safe. And still, I remember in the winter, they will still cook in the wood brick and stove because you still have to burn wood to stay warm. And they use the stoves mostly in the summer cooking when, you may don't want to burn wood in your big brick stove because it's already hot. And now let's talk about those ugly yellow pipes that provided natural gas to homes. In the big cities like Moscow, Kiev, they were buried underground. It only along the buildings, they install it outside, and then of course they go inside into apartments, but we didn't have them like everywhere like you see in small villages or towns. And that's pretty much the only size of the gas tank they had available. They had smaller ones, but no bigger. So it's not big enough to heat all your house if you'd like to install like a gas-fired furnace. I don't know if they ever had those. And I don't understand why they never designed systems similar to what they have here in the United States, probably in Canada, when you have a large propane tank sitting outside and it provides enough gas to keep your house warm in the winter. So instead of creating a network of producing, storing, and distributing propane like it's done in the United States, Soviet government, remember, centrally planned economy only in the late 60s, early 70s. So we're talking, what is that, like 60 years after the Soviet Union was created, decided to start so-called массовая газификация села. So it's like a widespread gasification with natural gas of small villages and towns. And of course, since the expense to lay the pipe was coming out of the government's pocket, they decided to go the cheapest route possible, and it's definitely way cheaper to run pipes above ground than digging trenches for miles or kilometers and kilometers. And of course, another problem, you already have established infrastructure in the villages or small towns, so destroying blacktop, digging trenches, digging across roads. So they decided just, who cares, it's ugly. People would prefer to have natural gas in their home to stay warm and look at the ugly pipes than have no gas at all. And this is a classic example. So it looks kind of like a nice neighborhood, at least further out, because there's a dirt road in front. So even if there's a road, they're just going to run pipes high enough for the trucks and cars to pass under. And this is pretty much what they see out of their windows every day. And this is my favorite photo. They didn't paint pipes yellow yet, but look, right across the walkway, there is a pipe. In Soviet Russia, pipe lays you. And I also read another explanation that above ground gas pipes are easier to inspect for damage and corrosion. So I guess another problem, quality of pipes weren't that good, so for visual inspection, definitely it's easier to find leaks and do repairs. So here's an example of lucky villagers that finally got natural gas into their ancient log cabin, and it definitely doesn't look that attractive. Log cabin with bright yellow pipes and a gas meter. And you know what could be more ugly than ugly yellow gas supply lines that installed above ground? Ugly, poorly insulated hot water supplies lines like you see in this photo. Never mind the fire. And now let's talk about gas and really quickly about electric meters. There was another question why they're installed inside of living room and kitchens. So electric meters in apartment buildings usually installed not in the actual apartment, but in the hallway. This way, you can still reset the breaker and the person who verifies the readings can have access to it. Electric meters were installed inside of the only houses, like my grandparents, they had electric meter inside. And the reason why it's indoors is because we didn't have actually distribution panels like they have here in America. So if you trip, we call it vybila probku, you don't want to go outside to reset your breaker. So the meter and the breaker was on the same unit indoors. So for the convenience, and it's just 220, no real distribution, just one line goes everywhere. So that's why electric meters in houses were inside. Situation with gas meters even more interesting. Guess what? In the Soviet Union, we did not have gas meters. I'm dead serious. It was just natural gas flowing without any measurement into your apartment, and you can really burn gas day and night, cook or whatever, and you're gonna still pay the same amount of money. And it was based on how many people occupied the apartment. So they knew, remember propiska? How many people live in a specific apartment, and based on the amount of people, there will be just fixed amount of for the natural gas. And only after Soviet Union collapsed and everything became capitalist, suddenly people started installing the gas meters. And the reason for it, because now gas company only knows how much gas was consumed by the whole building, so they just divide it by amount of apartments and bring the bill. So suddenly you could be paying for someone who's maybe cooking pies like a business. And that's what my mom actually did in the early 90s. She was making extra money by cooking pies, like, with cabbage or with meat and selling them. So then suddenly people are like, well, what about if I install my own meter? Then the company says, yeah, you can install the meter. Then you pay only for what you consume. And everyone started installing gas meters, as well as hot water meters and cold water meters, because now no one wants to pay for everyone else. Before that, we also had no water meters as well. And the way the gas lines ran in apartment buildings is the only way you can attach the meter is actually in the kitchen, because that's what the pipe is, and then just have a little line that you install the meter, and then you have a line that goes to your stove. So that's why it's right in the kitchen. So that's what I have in my apartment in Kiev. And now let's go back in the beginning and talk about dialing 04 in case of gas emergencies, which usually probably gas fire, and how often people had to do that during the Soviet days. It's kind of interesting, but I don't recall a single fire or a single gas emergency in my 20 years living in the Soviet Union. I have no doubt those things did happen, because if you have natural gas in your apartment or house and it has no meter, definitely would probably be some issues with explosions or fires. But since the Soviet government kept tight lid on any news like that, there was never any information on TV, radio, newspaper about, gas explosion in apartment buildings. We had this kind of false sense of security because we never heard of it. And when I was searching Google for natural gas fires in, Russia or Soviet Union, Ukraine, everything comes up like modern days. So now they report on it, there's the photos. And I would just guess, it's my guess, that it happens more often now than during the Soviet days, because infrastructure got older. Many of these apartment buildings, they had a 50-year lifespan. After that, it's supposed to be destroyed or remodeled. So remodeling never happened. So now those pipes are getting worse. There's a corrosion. Then, of course, people installing gas meters. So now we have more holes cut in the gas pipes. So I assume, it's my just educated guess, that right now situation is way worse with natural gas fires and explosions that used to be during the Soviet days. And before I wrap up this video, I want to show you this funny diagram. So I was researching about how many homes currently got natural gas in modern day Russia. And there was cute comparison on one of Russian propaganda site, and it claims that Russia has higher level of gasification than the United States. 70% in Russia versus 50% United States. So I'll let you think about it and write in the comment section what do you think. Well, my friends, I think that's all I have for you today. I hope you learned something new. As always, please don't forget to like this video. I always like to read your comments, so please comment below, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. Nice.
Так, теперь будем полить мусор.
Now it's Grandma gonna burn all the trash up first. Я сделаю відео, щоб жінка бачила.
Потрошку.
Ого, та ти багачка напекла.
Ну, які вже тобі напекла. Забереш там її утром, можна і вечором.
Ням-ням.